3. The Christian Passover. One of the most obvious facts about the Last Supper is that it was celebrated at the Passover meal. The continuity of the renewed or new covenant with the old was marked by the coincidence of the two rites. The fact that Jesus had selected 12 disciples made it clear that his community was the new Israel of God. There is no possibility of understanding the New Testament if its continuity with the Old is denied or underrated. While they were eating the Passover, Jesus called attention to the planned betrayal by Judas and then sent Judas out, Matthew 26:21, John 13:30. Then, as they were eating, Matthew 26:26, Mark 14:22, Jesus instituted the Christian Passover in his body and blood. To understand the Christian Passover, it is imperative that the Hebraic Passover be analyzed. Certain aspects of the original Passover require attention, therefore. First of all, the Passover celebrated the deliverance from Egypt and from the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. It was thus the Old Testament salvation and marked the beginning of Sabbaths, the day of rest in the Lord, commemorating salvation, Exodus 12:12-13, Deuteronomy 5:15. The first day of the festival falls on the 15th of Nisan, March to April, and lasts for 8 days. The Passover ritual, if it begins on a weekday, commences thus: Blessed art thou, O Eternal, our God, King of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. Blessed art thou, O Eternal, our God, King of the universe, who selected us from among all people and exalted us among nations, and did sanctify us with his commandments. And thou, O Eternal, our God, hast given us Sabbath days for rest and festival days for joy. This Sabbath and the days of this feast of the unleavened bread, the time of our deliverance, in love remembrance of the departure from Egypt. For us hast thou selected and sanctified from amongst all nations, in that thou caused us to inherit thy holy Sabbath and festival days in love and favor. Blessed art thou, O Eternal, who hallowest the Sabbath and Israel and the festival days. These words make plain the fact of election, and the fact that sanctification is by law. God didst sanctify us with his commandments. The Orthodox service thus still reflects sound doctrine, justification by electing grace, and sanctification by law. Chapters 12 and 13 of Exodus witness to the fact of grace and cite the requirement of obedience to law, 13:9. Likewise, the Christian Passover celebrates the Christian day of salvation, the victory of Christ over sin and death, and hence, the day of resurrection marked the beginning of the Christian Sabbath. In most liturgies of the sacrament, the reading of the law, of the 10 Commandments, is basic to the service. In the Book of Common Prayer, the law is read at the beginning of the service, although it can be omitted if it is read at least one Sunday each month. If omitted, the summary of the law is read. In Calvin's Last Communion service order and in Knox's First Communion in Scotland, the law was not read, but it appeared in their liturgies in the form of excommunications pronounced specifically against all transgressors of the law. Second, the Hebraic Passover is a family service, and God ordered that the son not only ask a ritual question, but that the service be addressed to him. Exodus 13:14. The youngest son thus normally asks the question about the meaning of the service, and the purpose of the priest father's words is to make the meaning of the Passover known to him. The youngest present asks the 4 questions, which inquire as to the meaning of the night's ritual. The story of the deliverance from Egypt and its meaning is then declared by the head of the household and other participants. The Christian Passover is also a celebration by the family of Christ. Accordingly, children partook of the elements. The early church met in homes, usually at night, since the first day of the week was then a work day. The sacrament was celebrated as an agape feast, a love feast, a potluck dinner of all the members. Children shared in the meal. Nothing is clearer than the fact that infants were baptized, confirmed, and partook of the elements for perhaps the first 9 or 10 centuries of the Christian era. The Hebraic pattern of the Old Testament law was very strong in the Church. Even today, a Roman Catholic missal notes in its order of the Mass that at one point, quote-unquote, celebration of the Word, quote, this has been taken from the synagogue service of Israel, end quote. As a result, it required the action of a church council to depart from the practice of baptizing on the 8th day. Fetus, an African bishop, had raised a question as to, quote, whether infants were to be baptized, if need required, as soon as they were born, or not till the 8th day, according to the rule given in the case of circumcision, end quote. The synodical answer of St. Cyprian and a council of 66 bishops was this, quote, as to the case of infants, whereas you judge that they ought not to be baptized within 2 or 3 days after they are born, and that the rule of circumcision should be observed, so that none should be baptized and sanctified before the 8th day after he is born. We were all in our council of the contrary opinion. It was our unanimous resolution and judgment that the mercy and grace of God is to be denied to none as soon as he is born, end quote. The obvious intention of this decision was to permit the baptism of newborn babes who might die before the 8th day and thus remain unbaptized. Apparently, that early fear prevailed that such children would be denied the covenant salvation because they lacked the covenant rite. In essence, the 8th day requirement of the Old Testament was recognized and was set aside only to care for emergencies. It is not our purpose here to analyze the view of baptism held by the Council, but simply to call attention to the persistence of the Old Testament pattern. To return to the service of the communion, the evidence is clear, quote, that the communion itself was given to infants, and that immediately from the time of their baptism, end quote. As Bingham noted, this fact, quote, is frequently mentioned in Cyprian, Austin, Innocentius, and Gennadius, writers from the 3rd to the 5th century. Maldonat confesses it was in the Church for 600 years, and some of the authorities prove it to have been continued 2 or 3 ages more, and to have been the common practice beyond the time of Charles the Great, end quote. This fact represented the persistence of the Old Testament pattern very clearly. No biblical reason can be given for eliminating children from the sacrament. The sense of covenant life is destroyed by their exclusion, and God's law violated. The reason for their exclusion is found in 1 Corinthians 11:28, the requirement of self-examination, just as the limitation of the meal to a token is based on verses 22 and 34. There may be grounds for the latter fact, although there cannot be a limitation of the sacrament to the token meal only. However, self-examination was a part of the Hebraic ceremony. This brings us to our third point of importance, the aspect of preparation for the Passover. In the Hebrew home on the 13th of Nisan in the evening, the head of the household searched the house with a lighted candle to eliminate all leaven, including all bread made from leavened dough of wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Then, in the Seder, the first 2 days of the Passover festival, quote, the emphasis on children's participation, end quote, was pronounced. How do these two facts reconcile themselves with the requirement of preparation and self-examination? How can children be included? The ritual of searching the house to eliminate all leaven was an enacted symbol of the need to eliminate corruption from the life of the family and from the individual. As such, it was a vivid sign to all children from their earliest days of the need for self-examination, the need to eliminate every corrupting influence and habit from their lives. The child, as a member of the covenant, was thus from his earliest memories instructed in the meaning of membership in the covenant. The early Christians pushed the implications further than did the Hebrews, in that babes in arms had the elements placed in their mouths. More than a little superstitious belief may have entered into this practice. This does not eliminate the biblical requirement that the service include all children able to ask the question as to the meaning of the service. The service, moreover, is both a celebration and a teaching service, to instruct all present in the fact of salvation and its meaning. Fourth, the Passover commemorated a victory and looked forward to more victory. The word salvation can also be translated as victory. The Orthodox Jewish service reads at one point, "May He who is most merciful break the yoke of our captivity from off our neck and lead us securely to our land." This is a future-oriented faith, one which expects victory and then looks to Elijah to come as its herald. Similarly, the Christian Passover has its purpose stated by St. Paul. "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till he come." 1 Corinthians 11:26. According to Hodge, the meaning of this verse is that, quote, as the Passover was a perpetual commemoration of the deliverance out of Egypt, and a prediction of the coming and death of the Lamb of God, who was to bear the sins of the world, so the Lord's Supper is at once the commemoration of the death of Christ and a pledge of his coming the second time without sin unto salvation." End quote. This is true enough, but is it all that this statement means? Calvin commented, quote, "The supper, then, is, so to speak, a kind of memorial which must always remain in the church until the last coming of Christ. And it has been appointed for this purpose, that Christ may put us in mind of the benefit of his death, that we may recognize it before men. Hence it has the name of the Eucharist, from having given thanks." End quote. This is better, in that Calvin spoke, quote, "of the benefits of his, Christ's, death." End quote. The meaning of the Lord's death is the death of sin and of death. It means salvation or victory. The Christian Passover must declare the victory of God and of the people of God. "But the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace." Psalm 37:11. The dimension of victory is so basic to the sacrament that to observe it without a declaration of that victory is to deny the sacrament. The Old Testament Passover, which is the heritage of all Christians, saw the firstborn of all Egypt slain and the people of God delivered from bondage. The New Testament Passover saw the people of God, sinners in themselves, delivered by the death of God's firstborn, in whom they have victory. Fifth, the death of the firstborn is basic to the Passover. In the Old Testament Passover, the firstborn of Egypt were slain. The requirement of Israel was that all the firstborn whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. Exodus 13:2. The firstborn of God's enemies are slain. All the firstborn of the covenant, representing all within the covenant, are either given or dedicated to God, or must be slain. Exodus 13:13. The Passover is life and victory to those who are faithful to the covenant. It leads to the promised land. In the Christian Passover, the death sentence upon the firstborn of the covenant, who are all sinners, is assumed by God's firstborn, Jesus Christ, the new Adam. The death sentence is ultimately enforced on all others. For the people of the covenant of Christ, the Passover means deliverance to the promised land. This is victory in time and eternity. The Jews for weary ages have celebrated their Passover, declaring, "Next year in Jerusalem." Such a spirit echoes the victory of the original Passover. The victory of the Christian Passover is far greater. For an observance of the Lord's table to be devoid of this note of victory is to deny the sacrament. The Christian Passover thus means that all men outside the covenant are under the 10th plague. Only those within are covered by the blood of the Lamb and assured of victory and deliverance to the promised land, the new creation of God. St. Paul referred both to the self-examination, purging the house of leaven, and the victory over all enemies, when he wrote, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast." 1 Corinthians 5:7-8.